The stars had always been cold and silent, but on that day they witnessed something the galaxy would never forget. Cole stood at the observation window of her small patrol station above the colony world of Harvest III. She was 42 years old with grey streaks in her dark hair and eyes that had seen too much of space to be impressed by anything anymore. The station was quiet, and the crew was going about their routine duties when the alarms began to scream. Rushed to the command center where her officers were at their screens with faces turning pale. Lieutenant Webb was the first to speak and his voice was shaking. He said that ships were coming out of the light travel and they were not human ships. Looked at the screen and felt her stomach drop. The vessels were massive and in design with sharp angles and weapons that glowed with an ugly green light. She recognized them immediately. They were warships and there were hundreds of them. They were one of the 12 ruling species of the Galactic Conclave. They had controlled this region of space for 10,000 years, and they viewed humanity as nothing more than pests who had crawled out of their little blue planet and spread to a few nearby stars. The Conclave had drawn borders around human space and told them to stay within those lines. Humanity had obeyed because they had no choice. Their ships were small and their weapons were weak compared to the ancient powers that ruled the stars. Opened a communication channel and tried to contact the fleet. She asked them to state their intentions and reminded them that Harvest III was a civilian colony under Conclave protection treaties. The response came in the form of a single transmission. A commander appeared on screen with his clicking mandibles and compound eyes that showed no emotion at all. He said that the colony world had been designated for mining operations and that all human presence was to be removed. Asked what he meant by removed, the commander ended the transmission without. The first plasma bombardment hit the surface of Harvest III 7 minutes later, watched in horror as green fire rained down on cities and farms and schools. The colony had 14 million people living on it. 14 million human beings who had built homes and raised families and dreamed of a future among the stars. The ships moved in systematic patterns and burned everything they touched. Tried to send distress calls, but they were jamming all communications. She ordered her small station crew to prepare for evacuation, but she knew there was nothing they could do. Her patrol station had 2 light cannons that would bounce harmlessly off shields. She had 12 crew members and a shuttle that could hold 20 people. Down on the surface there were 14 million souls dying while she watched. The massacre lasted 6 hours. They were thorough in their work. They destroyed the cities first and then moved to the smaller towns. They hunted down fleeing vehicles and shot them from the sky. When ground forces finally landed, they walked through the ruins and killed anyone they found still breathing. They recorded everything and broadcast it on open channels so that any human ship in range could see what was happening. It was not just an attack, it was a message. Watched until she could not watch anymore. She watched families running through burning streets. She watched children crying for parents who would never answer. She watched the end of everything she had sworn to protect. When the last ship finally departed, there was nothing left on Harvest III but ash and silence and the fading heat of plasma fires. The communication jamming ended and immediately sent her report to Earth Command. She did not know what words to use, so she simply transmitted the recordings she had captured. Let them see what she had seen. Let them understand what had been done. Secretary General Daniel contacted her 3 hours later. His face on the view screen was grey and his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. He told that the Conclave had already sent an official message. They considered the matter closed. They had acted within their rights as a senior species, and humanity was advised to accept the loss and continue existing within approved boundaries. Asked what that meant, Daniel said it meant the galaxy expected them to do nothing. It meant that 14 million dead humans were not worth a single diplomatic complaint. It meant that in the eyes of the Conclave they were insects who had been stepped on and should be grateful the boot had not come down harder. Felt something change inside her at that moment. The fear and horror that had gripped her heart began to transform into something else. It became cold and hard and patient. She asked Daniel what their response would be. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he told her that for 300 years humanity had accepted its place in the galaxy. They had bowed and scraped and followed every rule the Conclave set down. They had done this because they believed that peace was worth any price, and that the older species would accept them as equals. 14 million people had just paid the true cost of that belief. Daniel told that effective immediately, the human confederacy was entering a state of total war. Every shipyard would operate at maximum capacity. Every factory would convert to military production. Every scientist would focus on weapons development. He promoted to fleet admiral and gave her command of all naval forces in the outer territories. Her orders were simple. She was to build a fleet capable of making the galaxy remember what happened when someone touched humanity. Accepted her orders and asked how long she had. Daniel said they would need at least 10 years to build what they needed. 10 years of hiding their true strength, 10 years of letting the galaxy think they were still the same weak and frightened species, 10 years of planning and waiting. Said she understood and asked one more question. She asked if there would be limits on what she could do when the time came. Daniel looked at her through the screen and his eyes were filled with grief and rage and something that might have been hope. He told her to make them remember. He told her to make sure the galaxy never forgot what happened when they hurt humanity. Then he ended the transmission and Cole was alone with the stars and the silence and the memory of 14 million dead. She looked out the window at the burned world below and made a promise. She promised that the dead would not be forgotten. She promised that they would answer for what they had done. She promised that humanity would never again be seen as prey. The galaxy would learn to fear them and the lesson would be written in fire. 10 years passed and humanity changed in ways the galaxy could not imagine. On the surface, everything looked the same. Human traders still moved through approved shipping lanes. Human diplomats still smiled and bowed when they met conclave representatives. Human colonies still operated within the borders that had been drawn around them. But beneath that surface, something massive was growing in the darkness. Fleet Admiral Cole oversaw the construction from her command ship, the Resolute. The ship was unlike anything humanity had ever built. It stretched 3 from bow to stern and carried enough weapons to crack a small moon. The Resolute was the first of its kind, but it would not be the last. In hidden shipyards scattered across human space, hundreds of similar vessels were taking shape. Held weekly meetings with her senior staff in the war room of the Resolute. Captain Benjamin Ward was her tactical officer and a man who had lost his entire family on Harvest III. He studied military tactics with the obsession of someone who had a personal score to settle. Commander Lisa Grant was the chief engineer who had designed the new weapon systems that would give humanity an edge in the coming conflict. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Price ran the intelligence division and spent his days gathering information about every species in the conclave. At one of these meetings, Benjamin presented his latest analysis of. He explained that they had not upgraded their military in over 3,000 years. They had no reason to change because no one had ever challenged them. Their ships were powerful by ancient standards, but they relied on the same technology their ancestors had used. They had stopped innovating because they believed they had already achieved perfection. Lisa added that human scientists had made remarkable progress in the last decade. They had developed shield generators that could absorb 10 times more damage than anything they possessed. They had created weapons that could punch through enemy armor like paper. They had built engines that made their ships and more than anything else in the galaxy. The thought humans were primitives and that arrogance would be their downfall. Samuel reported on the political situation within the conclave. The 12 ruling species were content with their power and had no interest in human affairs. The thought humanity was amusing itself with pointless military exercises. They were taking bets on how quickly they would crush any human resistance. The others did not care enough to form an opinion. They all assumed that humans would eventually accept their place and return to being the quiet little species that knew when to bow. Listened to all of this and felt satisfaction growing in her chest. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The galaxy had forgotten about humanity after the massacre. They had moved on to other concerns and other conflicts while humans quietly built the largest military force their species had ever assembled. When the time came, the shock would be total. She asked for a status report on the fleet. Benjamin told her that they had 742 capital ships ready for deployment. They had 2,000 support vessels including troop transports and supply ships. They had 16 million soldiers in the Marine Corps who had trained for 10 years to fight the enemies of humanity. Every single one of those soldiers had seen the recordings from Harvest III. Every single one of them knew exactly why they were fighting. And said it was time to discuss the rules of engagement. She knew this was a difficult subject because many of her officers had personal reasons to want revenge. Benjamin spoke up and asked what limits there would be. He wanted to know if they were going to do to what had been done to Harvest III. His voice was steady but could hear the anger beneath it. She looked around the room at the faces of her officers. She saw grief and rage and the desire for vengeance that burned in all of them. She understood those feelings because she felt them too, but she also understood something else. She understood that the choice they made in the coming war would define humanity for all time. Told them that she had no intention of civilians. She said that they were not going to become the monsters they were fighting against. She watched the relief spread across several faces, but she was not finished. She continued by saying that she also had no intention of showing mercy to any military target. Their warships would be destroyed. Their military bases would be reduced to rubble. Their government would face justice for the crimes they had committed. Anyone who had participated in the Harvest III massacre would answer for what they had done. She explained that this war was not about revenge, even though revenge would be part of it. This war was about something larger. It was about making sure that no species in the galaxy ever again looked at humanity and saw an easy target. It was about teaching the conclave that humans were not insects to be crushed. It was about creating a future where human children could grow up without fearing that their world might be burned on the whim of some alien commander. Lisa raised a practical concern. She pointed out that the Conclave would not sit by while humanity dismantled one of their member species. The moment humans achieved significant success, the other 11 species would intervene. Their combined fleets would be overwhelming even with all the advantages humanity had developed. Smiled, and it was not a warm expression. She said that she was counting on it. She explained that the plan had never been just to defeat the plan was to defeat everyone who might threaten humanity ever again. The Conclave would come to the of their member, and when they did, humanity would show them what 10 years of hidden preparation had produced. The officers exchanged glances, but no one questioned her. They had followed Cole for a decade, and they trusted her. She had proven herself 100 times over in the planning and building of this fleet. If she said they were ready to face the entire galaxy, then they believed her. Dismissed the meeting and stood alone in the war room. She looked at the holographic display showing the fleet she had built. 700 capital ships floating in the darkness waiting for their moment. 16 million soldiers ready to fight and die for their species. It was a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, and soon she would unleash it. She thought about the dead of Harvest III and the promise she had made. The waiting was almost over. The galaxy would learn to fear humanity, and the lesson would begin very soon. The border station was the first to see them coming. Station commander was a veteran officer who had served the Dominion for 60 years and had never experienced anything resembling fear. He was reviewing supply reports when his sensor officer made a sound that no had made in 3,000 years. It was a sound of pure terror. Demanded to know what was happening, and the sensor officer could barely speak. He pointed at the screen with a trembling limb and looked. What he saw made his compound eyes widen in disbelief. Ships were emerging from the light travel. Human ships, not the small patrol craft that sometimes encountered, but massive warships of impossible size. They kept coming in wave after wave until the sensors could no longer count them all. At the head of the formation was a vessel that comprehension. It was 3 long and covered with weapon systems that glowed with barely contained energy. The ship broadcast a single identifier that appeared on every screen in the station. It was the Resolute, and it was the flagship of something called the United Earth Expeditionary Force. Forced himself to remain calm, he opened a communication channel and spoke with the authority of the Dominion. He told the human vessel that it was in violation of Conclave boundaries and ordered it to withdraw immediately or face destruction. He expected the humans to flee or surrender or beg for mercy, as their kind always did. The response came not through the communication system but through every speaker and screen and device on the station at once. The voice was female and calm and utterly without fear. It identified itself as Fleet Admiral Cole of the United Earth Confederacy. She said that 10 years ago they had murdered 14 million human citizens. She said that they had broadcast those deaths as entertainment and had expected humanity to accept it. She said that they had expected humanity to remember its place. The station shuddered as the human fleet began to move forward. Admiral Cole continued speaking. She said that humanity had remembered, but not in the way they intended. Scrambled to activate the emergency beacon and call for reinforcements, but the human fleet was already targeting his communication arrays. Admiral Cole told him that his government would receive no warning. His military would have no time to prepare. They had come to harvest III without mercy, and humanity had learned from their example. The lights flickered as the first human weapons fired. Admiral Cole spoke her final words to the station. She welcomed them to the consequences of their choices. Station ceased to exist 43 seconds later. The invasion of space had begun. The High Command learned of the attack 6 hours later when a refugee ship finally reached a communication relay. Supreme Commander stared at the tactical display in his war room and could not believe what he was seeing. He declared it impossible. He said that humans had no military capability and that they were primitives who had been put in their place 10 years ago. His strategic advisor was more practical. He pointed out that humans had clearly been hiding their development for a decade. Their intelligence had completely failed to detect the threat, refused to accept this. He ordered the Grand Fleet to mobilize. Every ship and every soldier would gather to crush these creatures and remind them why the galaxy feared them. The Grand Fleet assembled over the 8,000 warships, representing 10 millennia of military might. It was the largest force that had ever gathered and was confident that it would end this rebellion quickly. He had seen the recordings from and admitted that the human weapons were impressive, but numbers would tell in the end. Received reports of the mobilization and adjusted her strategy. She divided her fleet into 7 task forces that struck at different targets across space. She herself led the primary force directly toward the enemy. Her ships moved with precision and coordination that they could not match. Every military installation they encountered was destroyed. Every defensive position was overwhelmed. The advance was relentless. The 2 fleets finally met in the home system after 43 days of combat. 8,000 warships faced 712 human vessels. Supreme Commander broadcast on an open channel. He told Admiral Cole that she had fought well for her species, but it was over. He offered her a choice. Surrender and her soldiers would receive swift deaths. Continue and they would hunt down every human in existence. His response was brief. She said that he talked too much. Then she gave the order to attack. The Battle of Prime lasted 16 hours. It became the most one-sided military engagement in galactic history. Human ships moved together like a single organism. Their weapons struck with accuracy that seemed almost impossible. They fired everything they had, but human shields absorbed damage that should have been fatal. By the 6th hour they had lost 3,000 ships. By the 12th hour they had lost 6,000. When the battle finally ended, fewer than 500 vessels remained operational. The Grand Fleet that had never known defeat in 10,000 years had been annihilated. Supreme Commander sat in his disabled flagship and waited for death. His weapons were destroyed. His engines were dead. Escape was impossible. He expected the humans to finish what they had started. He expected them to kill him as they had killed so many others. Instead, a shuttle arrived and docked with his ship. Marines in heavy armor escorted a single figure onto his bridge. It was a human female with grey hair and tired eyes. She wore an admiral's uniform and carried no weapons. She looked at with an expression he could not read. She introduced herself as Fleet Admiral Cole and said she was there to accept his surrender. Managed a broken laugh. He said she had won and told her to do what her kind always did. He expected her to slaughter thee as they had slaughtered humanity. Looked at him for a long moment. She asked if that was what he would do. Said it was what any species would do. It was what they had done. Slowly, she said that perhaps that was the difference between them. She turned to her Marines and ordered them to secure the vessel. She told them to make sure the crew was treated according to the rules of war. Any human soldier who mistreated a prisoner would answer to her personally. Did not understand. He asked why she would not take revenge. Said she had taken all the revenge she needed. The military was destroyed. Their government would face trial for harvest III. Their species would live under occupation until they were no longer a threat. But she would not murder civilians to prove a point. She would not become the thing she was fighting against. The occupation of space took 3 months to complete. Human forces established control over all 63 star systems with minimal civilian casualties. Those who had directly participated in the Harvest III massacre were identified and arrested. They were transporting to human space where they would face trial for their crimes. The rest of the population was left alone to continue their lives under watchful supervision. But the galaxy was watching everything that happened. In the great halls of the conclave, representatives of the 11 remaining member species gathered to discuss the unprecedented situation. High Arbiter of the called the emergency session to order. There were massive beings made of living silicon, and they had ruled the conclave for longer than most species could remember. Was ancient even by their standards, and he was angry. He declared that the humans had destroyed a conclave member. This could not be allowed to stand. The combined fleets of the conclave must respond with overwhelming force before humanity grew bolder. Some species voiced agreement, others remained silent. The chamber was filled with tension. Voice Eternal of the spoke against military action. There were beings of liquid metal that shifted constantly as they moved. Voice Eternal had studied the recordings of the Battle of Prime. Analysts believed that humans could defeat any 3-member species simultaneously, perhaps even more. War would be catastrophic for everyone involved. Demanded to know what alternative existed. Should they simply accept this insult to conclave authority? Voice Eternal had no good answer. A new voice entered the debate. It belonged to Whisper of Wisdom, who represented there were small reptilian beings, but they were the member species of the conclave. They had been traveling between stars when most other species were still learning to use fire. Whisper of Wisdom commanded respect that even could not ignore. The ancient ambassador suggested that they consider why this had happened. For 300 years, humans had asked only to be left alone. The conclave had denied them a seat on the council. The conclave had confined them to a small region of space. The conclave had allowed them to massacre their colony without consequence. Perhaps humans were not entirely to blame for what followed. Insisted that humans were primitives who needed to be taught their place. Whisper of Wisdom activated a holographic display showing footage from the recent battle. The ancient ambassador asked if this looked primitive. Human technology now surpassed conclave standards in numerous areas. Human military coordination exceeded anything the member species had achieved. Humans had done in 10 years what the conclave had taken 10,000 years to accomplish. Voice Eternal asked what conclusion should be drawn from this. Whisper of Wisdom said that the conclave had made a terrible mistake. They had looked at humans and seen weakness because humans valued peace. They had interpreted patience as submission. They had been completely wrong. The question now was whether they would compound that mistake with another. They could unite against humanity. They could throw their combined fleets at the human military. They might win, but at the cost of billions of lives and the destruction of civilizations that had lasted for millennia. Whisper of Wisdom offered an alternative. Perhaps it was time to recognize that the galaxy had changed. A new power had emerged and they had not sought this conflict. The Conclave had forced it upon them. Perhaps it was time to offer what should have been offered 3 centuries ago: genuine respect and a place among equals. The chamber fell silent as the member species considered this proposal. Some were outraged at the suggestion. Others saw the wisdom in avoiding a war they might not survive. The debate continued for hours. Fleet Admiral Cole learned of the Conclave's discussions through intelligence reports. She was reviewing occupation operations when word came that the Conclave wanted to meet with her, not to issue demands or ultimatums, but to discuss terms. The message specifically requested her presence as humanity's representative. Benjamin Ward warned her that it was probably a trap, agreed that this was possible, but she had to take the chance. If there was any possibility of ending the conflict without more bloodshed, she needed to explore it. She traveled to the Conclave's neutral station with a single escort ship. She left the fleet under Benjamin's command with clear orders. If she did not return within 72 hours, they were to assume the worst and respond accordingly. The Conclave chamber was vast enough to accommodate species of wildly different sizes and environmental needs. Found herself standing before 11 alien beings. Each one represented a civilization older and more powerful than humanity had ever been. She felt small in that chamber, but she refused to show it. High Arbiter spoke first. He acknowledged the human victory over the Dominion. The Conclave was prepared to discuss the future, inclined her head and said she was listening. Explained that the Conclave had always required newer species to prove themselves worthy of full membership. Humans had now proven themselves through force of arms. The Conclave was prepared to offer humanity a seat on the Council with all rights and privileges, equal standing among the great powers of the galaxy. Considered the offer: 300 years of struggle and discrimination, 300 years of being treated as inferior. Now they were offering everything humanity had been denied. She said, "Not yet." The Council stirred with surprise. Voice Eternal asked if she was refusing membership, explained that she was refusing to accept membership as a prize for winning a war. Humanity did not want to join a council that only respected those who could destroy them. They wanted to join a council that valued life and treaties and protected the weak instead of exploiting them. Made a sound of frustration. He said she was asking for the impossible. The galaxy had operated this way for millions of years. Replied that perhaps the galaxy needed to change. She looked at each ambassador in turn. She told them that they had offered membership because they feared what humanity might do without it. That was not respect. That was pragmatism. It meant the moment they thought they could destroy humanity, they would try. Whisper of Wisdom leaned forward and asked what she would have them do. Said she wanted reform, not just for humanity but for every species that would come after. She wanted actual protections for developing civilizations. She wanted accountability when member species committed atrocities. She wanted the Conclave to become something worth joining. The Ancient asked if she truly meant to reshape galactic civilization. Said she would try to save it. Because if humanity was the only species that believed in justice and compassion, then the galaxy was already lost. The negotiations took 12 years to complete. Every member species had demands and objections and concerns that needed to be addressed. There were moments when everything seemed ready to collapse. There were threats and walkouts and accusations of bad faith. Cole attended every major session and refused to give up even when her own people urged her to abandon diplomacy and simply impose terms by force. She was 71 years old when the final document was ready for signing. Her hair had gone completely white and her face was lined with the weight of decades, but her eyes were still sharp and her will was still iron. She sat in the observation lounge of the Resolute and watched the ceremony through the viewport. Representatives of 14 species gathered on the neutral station. 12 were the original Conclave members, including and even the 2 were newly recognized civilizations that had been given seats under the reformed system. They were young species who had been watching from the edges of known space. They had seen what humanity had done and what humanity had chosen not to do. Benjamin Ward stood beside. He was Admiral of the Third Fleet, now with grey at his temples and stars on his collar. He had followed her through war and peace and everything in between. He said it was hard to believe this was really happening. Kept her eyes on the ceremony. She said they would have to see if it lasted. Benjamin asked if she thought it would not. Replied that change was hard and old habits died slowly. But she also believed they had given the next generation a chance. That was more than anyone had given humanity. The document they were signing was called the New Compact. It established rights for all sentient beings regardless of their species or technological level. It created mechanisms for resolving disputes without violence. It set rules that prohibited attacks on civilian populations under any circumstances. It was everything had demanded and more. It represented a fundamental transformation in how galactic civilization would function. The ceremony required each species to present a light that would merge with the others at the center of the station. The combined lights would form a beacon that would broadcast continuously across the galaxy. Its message would be simple: you are not alone, you are not without hope, there is a community here that will protect you. Watch the lights begin to merge. She thought about the 14 million souls who had died on Harvest III. They had been ordinary people living ordinary lives. Farmers who worked the land and teachers who educated children and parents who dreamed of better futures. They had been murdered because a powerful species decided their lives were worthless. Their deaths had changed humanity forever. The galaxy had learned to fear what humans could do when pushed beyond endurance. But that fear alone was not enough. Fear faded over time. Fear could be overcome by arrogance or greed or simple forgetfulness. Had always known that winning the war was only the first step. The harder task was changing what victory meant. Previous conquerors had used their power to dominate and exploit. They had built empires on the suffering of others and called it natural order, had rejected that path from the beginning. She had refused to massacre civilians even when her own people cried out for vengeance. She had demanded justice instead of genocide and reform instead of subjugation. Some had called her weak for showing restraint. Some had accused her of betraying the dead by not repaying blood with blood, but understood something that her critics did not. Becoming monsters would not the victims of Harvest III. It would only create more victims and more grief and more cycles of violence without end. The lights finished merging and the beacon began to pulse. It cast a warm glow across the station and reached out into the darkness between stars. Somewhere out there, young civilizations were taking their first steps into space. They would detect this signal and know that the galaxy was not as cold and hostile as it appeared. Benjamin asked if it had been worth it. He meant everything: the lives lost on both sides, the years spent in conflict, the toll on his own soul from choices that would haunt her until her last breath. She considered the question carefully before. She told him to ask her again in 100 years. If the peace held and the reforms endured and some young species grew up in a galaxy where they did not have to fear genocide, then yes, it was worth everything. She placed her hand against the viewport and reached toward the light. She said that they had not just won a war, they had proven something important. They had proven that strength and compassion were not opposites. They had proven that you could stand against evil without becoming evil yourself. They had proven that victory meant nothing if you lost yourself in the process. The beacon continued to pulse with steady rhythm. Watched it and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. It was peace, not the false peace of submission that humanity had endured for 3 centuries. True peace born from strength and tempered by wisdom. She said that the galaxy had shaken when humanity arrived. The other species had expected monsters. They had expected conquerors who would burn and destroy without mercy. They had expected to see their own reflection in human faces. Instead, humanity had given them something better. They had given them hope. Hope that the future did not have to repeat the mistakes of the past. Hope that power could be used for protection instead of oppression. Hope that even in a universe full of darkness there was light worth fighting for. Cole died 3 years later in her sleep. She was buried on Harvest III in a memorial garden that had been planted over the ruins of the old colony. 14 million flowers bloomed there now, one for every soul that had been lost, one for every reason humanity had fought, one for every promise that had been kept. The galaxy continued to change after she was gone. The new compact held through challenges and crises. New species joined the reformed conclave and brought their own perspectives and gifts. Humanity took its place among the stars not as conquerors but as equals. And whenever someone asked how it had happened, they were told the story of Fleet Admiral Cole. They were told about a woman who had witnessed horror and refused to let it define her. They were told about a species that had been pushed to the edge of destruction and chose to answer with justice instead of vengeance. The galaxy had shaken when humanity arrived. Mercy had not been an option for those who had committed atrocities, but mercy had been the choice for everyone else. That was what made humanity different. That was what made humanity worthy of the stars. That was what made the galaxy shake not with fear but with hope.